Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another video on the Liam Talks Motorsport channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about a driver who lost his life on this day 54 years ago. And this particular driver is one of, if not the greatest Formula 1 driver of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, Jim Clark. So Jim Clark was born in 1936 in Scotland and grew up on a farm. He was the youngest and he was the only boy. And growing up, my great-grandmother actually knew the Clark family. But growing up, Jim liked motor racing, and his career really kicked off in 1959 when he did a race at Brands Hatch against his future friend and team boss Colin Chapman. And Clark was driving a similar car to him and absolutely kicked his bottom. So Chapman, because Chapman was a decent driver himself, decided to give Clark a go in his cars. So Clark made his F1 debut in 1960 and instantly impressed. In only his fifth race, he finished on the podium at the Portuguese Grand Prix, and 2 years later he took his first win at Spa. And over the course of his career he would take some just straight up dominant wins, some incredible performances, and just some incredible seasons. So now it's time to go into a little bit more detail about Jim Clark's career. In 1962 he took his first win at the Belgian Grand Prix, and the following year dominantly won the title ahead of the likes of Graham Hill, Richie Ginther and John Surtees. I want to point out that in 62 Lotus only had the second best car behind BRM, but in 63 they had the most dominant F1 car potentially ever. And that car was amazing, so was Clark, and he dominated in it. But then 1964, and BRM and Ferrari caught up with Lotus, and there was this titanic fight between the three Brits of Clark, Hill and Surtees, each driving for Lotus, BRM and Ferrari. And because of the poor reliability of his Lotus, Clark only came out third best, but was definitely the most talented out of the three of them, and proved this again in 65 by dominantly winning the title and the Indianapolis 500 and Tasman Series in the same year. He also won British touring cars at some point in his career, as well as Formula 2, which he competed in. Then, in 1966, the formula changed from 1.5 to 3.0 in terms of the size of the engine, how fast it was, and the litres of it. And as a result, Lotus struggled and had really poor reliability. Clark still took a win though, and was still very quick, and this was when Clark was starting to prove he was one of the best, because he put in some very good performances. Like, it was 1963 in Belgium when he lapped everyone except Bruce McLaren, and keep in mind Spa at the time was about 8 miles long, so to lap everyone except one driver around an 8-mile long circuit is incredible. He won by over 4 minutes from McLaren in what was probably one of the best races of all time from a driver's perspective. And even though Clark despised Spa-Francorchamps, he dominated around there. He was very quick around there as well. And then in 1967, the Lotus was back to form, as was Clark, but Clark still couldn't beat the Brabham cars to the title because his car was unreliable. Lotus had Graham Hill and Jim Clark in their cars for that season, and Brabham had Denny Hulme and Jack Brabham, and Brabham had 3 DNFs out of 22 starts, because there was 11 races that year, so 2 cars, 22 starts, and they had 3 DNFs. Meanwhile, Lotus had 11. They had an average of 1 DNF per race. So because of how unreliable their car was, Clark didn't win the title despite taking double the wins of Brabham and Hulme, because Brabham took 2 wins, Hulme took 2 wins, and Clark took 4. So he took the same amount of wins as Brabham and Hulme combined. And it was in this season he put on probably the greatest performance from a racing driver in motorsport history at the 1967 Italian Grand Prix. Because Clark took pole and led before he got a puncture and fell a lap down behind everyone. He managed to fight his way through the field and get back up into first, which was extraordinary because there was 20 or so cars in the field, including drivers like Jackie Stewart, Jack Brabham, John Surtees, Denny Hulme, and Bruce McLaren, and even Graham Hill, of course, and Chris Amon, and Dan Gurney, and Joe Sifford, and Jochen Rindt, and Jackie X. I mean, this grid was very good. Some of them were in slightly worse cars though. But despite this, he still managed to get through that field and led the race until he ran out of fuel on the very last lap and finished third. Finished behind John Surtees, who took Honda's last win in F1 for 39 years as a team and for nearly 2 decades as an engine supplier. Brabham was second in his Brabham Repco. Meanwhile, Clark, the unluckiest bloke in the world, barring Chris Amon obviously, was third. And heading into the 68 season, looking as if Clark was going to dominate, because the Lotus, it looked very quick at the first round of the season in South Africa. It dominated. Clark won the race ahead of Hill. But as we all know, fate came to collect, because he had the option of racing at Hockenheim or at Brands Hatch, and he chose Hockenheim. And this is a mechanic's point of view now. So because his mechanic said that they couldn't get any heat into the tyres, and he said before the race, don't expect anything from me, because they tried everything to get the tyres warmed up, and he qualified quite poorly. But unfortunately, as we all know, fate came to collect, because Clark was running quite poorly. Then, on lap 5, tragedy struck, and he got a puncture. And because Hockenheim was surrounded by forest trees at the time, there was only one place he could go, and well, there was 2 places he could go, one into the crowd or into the trees. And because he was heading into a corner and there was trees that were the runoff, he couldn't go anywhere. And F1 lost its greatest ever driver on this day 54 years ago, and nothing can bring him back. Nothing. It's so sad, because he was the best racing driver of his generation and potentially ever, because he was such a good driver. He had such a good driving style, and he was such a clean driver, and he really made mistakes. He never did. And he was so quick. He managed to outclass a lot of drivers that were really good in that generation. In 1963 there was Graham Hill, Richie Ginther, Dan Gurney, John Surtees. In 65 there was Jackie Stewart, and by the end of his dominance in F1, even Jack Brabham and Denny Hulme, he pretty much beat, but his car was unreliable. And again, it comes into question his driving style, because the man's driving style was incredible. He could make sure the tyres did not get worn at all. And there's 2 stories I'd like to very quickly tell you. One of them was when he started a race and came back, tyres were in the same condition. And the other one, Clark said he felt like there was a problem with the car, and his mechanic that night went to have a look at the tyres, and he undid the tyres, and a wheel nut was slightly out of place. That's how much cleverness Clark had. That's how mechanically minded he was, and it really helped that he had a good team behind him that he loved, and he's the only world champion to have driven for only one team in his career, with Clark competing from 60 to 68 with Lotus. He took 8 Grand Slams, that's fastest lap, pole position, led every lap, and won the race, as well as 25 wins in 72 starts, 32 podium finishes, and 28 fastest laps. Jim Clark was the best. He was only 32 when he lost his life. He was, to put it simply, the best. I'd like to thank everyone who has watched this video, everyone who has liked, subscribed, commented on this video, and, most importantly, rest in peace, Jim Clark.